You are a nurse. You made it this far. Years of grueling training, endless late-night studies, and quiet sacrifices no one ever saw. You pushed through exhaustion, self-doubt, and the gnawing fear that you might never be enough. The anatomy books that blurred in the lamplight, the clinical rotations where you practiced injections on oranges because real patients still terrified you. You told yourself this was noble work. You pictured clean hospital corridors, smelling of antiseptic, predictable routines, patients who arrived broken and left whole, pain with limits, fear that could be managed, a life you had prepared for. That was the plan. But plans die fast in war. It started as distant headlines. Something happening to someone else. You listened to the wireless in the nurse's lounge after long shifts, the voices talking about Poland, then France, then the Battle of Britain. You told yourself America would stay out of it. You had your small apartment, your white uniform, your future. Then December 7th, 1941 came, Pearl Harbor. The world changed overnight. Your name was called. Not for a better posting in a stateside hospital, but for deployment. Drafted into the Army Nurse Corps. There was no time to prepare, no time for proper goodbyes. Just a uniform pressed into your hands, hurried orders, dog tags that felt too cold against your skin, and a destination you had only heard in fearful stories. The front. You packed a small suitcase with trembling hands, extra stockings, a few letters from home, a small Bible your mother insisted you take, and the stethoscope you had worked so hard to afford. You took one last look at the ordinary life you were leaving behind, the little kitchen where you made tea after night duty, the bed you thought you would always return to. You stepped out the door before the tears could start. The train ride felt like a fever dream. Carriages packed with silent strangers, young men in fresh uniforms, a few other nurses clutching the same worried expressions. No one spoke much. Outside the windows, green fields rolled by untouched. Houses stood quiet with laundry still hanging on lines, as if the world refused to acknowledge what was coming. Children waved at the train, not understanding. It felt like a betrayal. You stared at your hands, clean, steady hands that had only known sterile wards. What would they look like in a month? You tried to sleep but kept seeing the boy from your last rotation, the one who smiled when you changed his dressing. Would any of them smile where you were going? When you arrived, the air had changed, thick, metallic, laced with burnt earth diesel and that sickly stench of death you would never forget. The first artillery shell tore across the sky with a sound so deep it rattled your bones. Your body flinched before your mind could catch up. Someone shouted your name, and your legs carried you forward on pure instinct. The field hospital was chaos, barely held together by canvas and willpower. Tents jammed so tightly you had to turn sideways to move between them. Cots lined up in endless rows, blood turning the dirt floor into dark, sucking mud. Bandages and instruments lay scattered, never enough. The air throbbed with screams, barked orders, desperate gasping prayers, and the constant sound of suffering. There was no time to steady yourself. Your first patient was a boy, barely old enough to be called a man. His uniform hung in shreds, his breathing shallow and wet with that horrible gurgling. Shrapnel had torn through his chest, but it was his eyes wide, searching, begging for something your training had never prepared you to give, that nearly broke you. For one terrible second, you froze. This isn't what I prepared for. I should be in a clean ward with charts and visiting hours. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Nurse, we need you now." Something inside you snapped into place. Your hands moved. Pressure, clamp, bandage, morphine, stabilize. You stopped thinking. Thinking cost lives here. More wounded flooded in, some pleading for their mothers, some unconscious, some already gone. by the time they reached your table. You learned not to ask names. There wasn't time, and it hurt too much. You worked for 18 hours straight that first day. When you finally stumbled outside for air, another explosion lit the horizon like lightning from hell. You didn't flinch this time. The realization chilled you more than the blast itself. You were already changing. That night, in the fragile minutes of quiet between incoming casualties, the weight finally crashed down. You sat on an empty ammo crate behind the tent, helmet off, hair matted with sweat, and someone else's blood. Exhaustion, fear, grief for the woman you had been on that train. You thought of the clean corridors, the smell of coffee in the hospital cafeteria, the way patients used to thank you with flowers, that life now felt like it belonged to a stranger. Tears came then, hot, silent. You let them fall for exactly 2 minutes. Then you wiped your face, straightened your stained apron, and stood up. Because they need you. Footsteps. Another stretcher. You went back in. The days blurred into one endless river of blood, morphine, prayer, and impossible choices. You learned new rhythms. Triage under red lights so you wouldn't ruin your night vision. Amputations by lantern light while shells shook dust from the tent roof onto the open wounds. Holding the hand of a soldier who whispered his girlfriend's name as he slipped away. Writing letters home for men who could no longer hold a pen, telling their families how brave they were, even as their bodies betrayed them. You rationed sulfa powder like it was gold. You boiled instruments in helmets because the autoclave had been destroyed 2 nights earlier. You ate cold beans from cans while standing, your back aching so badly you sometimes cried when you finally sat down. Sleep came in 20-minute fragments on a cot that smelled of mud and ether. You woke to the sound of incoming wounded and ran without thinking, your feet moving before your eyes were fully open. One morning, a young lieutenant came in with half his face burned. He kept asking for water, but you couldn't give him any because of the risk. You held his hand instead and told him stories about your hometown, about summer fairs and fireflies, anything to keep him calm while the doctor cleaned the wounds. He survived the night, but you never saw him again. Another time, a soldier no older than 19 arrived with his legs gone below the knees. He looked at you with such calm acceptance, it frightened you more than the screaming ones. He said, "Just make sure I can still dance with my girl when I get home. Okay, nurse?" You smiled through the tears and promised you would do everything you could. You kept that promise even when it meant staying at his side for hours after your shift ended. Some nights the tents fell quiet for an hour or two, and you would step outside to look at the stars. They were the same stars you saw back home, bright and indifferent. It made you feel small and furious all at once. You began to recognize the different sounds of shells, the high whistle of the ones that would land far away, the deep whoosh of the dangerous close ones. You learned which patients had a chance and which ones you simply sat with so they wouldn't die alone. You wrote letters you knew might never reach their destinations. You sang quiet hymns to men who no longer responded. You held babies born in the middle of artillery fire because their mothers had been caught in the crossfire of retreating lines. You watched friendships form and shatter in a single afternoon. You saw courage in the smallest things, a soldier sharing his last cigarette, another giving up his blanket for a man shivering with fever. And you saw the darkness too, the way fear could turn good men cruel for a moment, the way some broke completely and had to be carried away, not by wounds, but by their minds. Weeks turned into months. Your uniform no longer looked white. Your hands developed calluses and constant tremors that only stopped when real work began. You stopped looking in mirrors because the woman staring back had hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. Yet every time a new wave of casualties arrived, something stubborn inside you rose up again. You kept going because no one else was coming. Because the boy on the stretcher needed you more than you needed rest. Because in the middle of all this hell, you had become the thin line between life and death, held up by nothing but tired hands and a will that refused to break. You still dreamed sometimes of clean corridors and normal life, but those dreams grew fainter. The war had rewritten you. You were no longer the nurse who hoped for peace. You were the one standing in the middle of it, doing what had to be done. And when morning came, no matter how heavy the night had been, you would stand up, wash the blood from your arms, and do it all over again. Because they needed you. Because lives still mattered. Because even in the worst of times, one pair of hands could still pull someone back from the edge. And that was enough to keep you moving forward, one wounded soul at a time.